Welcome to Criminal Nights. Tonight, I'll take you into the shadows of true crime, where the neon lights of Sin City cast the darkest shadows imaginable. I'm your host, and for the next few hours, we'll walk together through the twisted corridors of Las Vegas's city that never sleeps, where fortunes are made and lost in a single hand, and where some secrets are buried deeper than bodies in the Nevada desert. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching Criminal Nights from. Are you alone in your room right now? Or maybe you're one of those brave souls listening while walking through your own city's dark streets. Let us know. We love hearing from our fellow night wanderers. Tonight, we're going to Vegas, baby. But this isn't the Vegas of tourist brochures and wedding chapels. This is the Vegas where desperation meets opportunity, where the house always wins, and where sometimes the only way out is through violence. Our first story takes us back to June 7th, 1996, and I still remember the heat of that desert summer pressing against my skin like a furnace as I stood outside the Luxor Hotel. The pyramid's black glass reflected nothing but darkness, even in daylight, and I couldn't help but think how fitting that was for what had happened inside just hours before. Tupac Shakur was in Vegas that night, not for the lights or the slots, but for the Mike Tyson-Bruce Seldon fight at the MGM Grand. I can still hear the echo of thousands of voices from that arena, the thunderous cheers that would soon turn to screams in the street. But let me take you back to the beginning, to September 7th, when everything changed. The air in Las Vegas that night was thick with more than just desert heat. There was electricity, the kind that comes before a storm, or before blood is spilled. Tupac had just watched Iron Mike destroy Seldon in 109 seconds, and the adrenaline was pumping through everyone's veins like liquid fire. I can still see the MGM Grand's lobby, packed with people riding high on the violence they'd just witnessed, not knowing they were about to witness something far more real, far more devastating. Security footage from that night shows Tupac and his entourage near the casino's elevators at approximately 8:30 p.m. What it doesn't show is the tension that had been building for months, tension that would explode into violence before the night was over. See? Orlando Anderson was also at that fight, and when Tupac spotted him, everything went sideways. I've walked that exact stretch of carpet in the MGM Grand lobby dozens of times since then, trying to understand what happened in those crucial moments. The marble floor is so polished you can see your reflection, but all I ever see is the ghost of what happened there. Tupac, Suge Knight, and their crew surrounded Orlando Anderson near the elevators. The surveillance video shows the altercation, lasting maybe 90 seconds. But those 90 seconds lit a fuse that would detonate less than 3 hours later. Orlando Anderson was no random target. He was affiliated with the Southside Compton Crips, and there was bad blood between him and Death Row Records going back months. Earlier that year, Anderson had allegedly been involved in snatching a Death Row medallion from one of Tupac's associates at a Lakewood mall. In the street code that governed these men's lives, that was an act of war. The MGM Grand security team broke up the fight quickly, but the damage was done. I can imagine Anderson's humiliation, being jumped in front of hundreds of witnesses in one of the most public places in America. The sting of that embarrassment, the rage building in his chest, these are the ingredients that turn a bad night into a deadly one. After the altercation, Tupac's group left the MGM Grand around 10:15 p.m. The plan was to head to Club 660, a nightclub owned by Suge Knight, for an after-party. But first, they needed to stop by Suge's house to change clothes. I've driven that route myself many times, from the Strip to Suge's mansion in the hills, and it's a journey that takes you from the artificial paradise of the casinos into the real Las Vegas, the residential areas where normal people live normal lives, unaware that history is speeding past their windows in a black BMW. Tupac rode with Suge in his black BMW 750. and I remember seeing photos of that car later. Powerful, the kind of machine that commanded respect on the streets. They were followed by a caravan of cars filled with death row associates, but in the world, they moved in. Even a convoy couldn't guarantee safety. The temperature that night was still hovering around 85 degrees, typical for September in the desert, and I imagine the windows were down as they cruised through the streets. Tupac was reportedly in good spirits, energized by the fight and looking forward to the party. He had no way of knowing that Orlando Anderson and his associates were already moving, planning their response to the MGM Grand humiliation. At approximately 10:55 p.m., Tupac and Suge were stopped at a red light at the intersection of East Flamingo Road and Covell Lane. It's a busy intersection, even late at night, with traffic flowing from the strip toward the residential areas. I've stood at that exact corner many times, watching the light cycle from green to yellow to red, trying to understand how everything went so wrong so fast. A white Cadillac pulled up alongside the BMW. The occupants were never definitively identified, but witnesses described seeing arms extend from the passenger window. What happened next lasted only seconds, but those seconds shattered everything. The first shot punched through the night air like thunder. Then another, and another. 13 shots in total, fired from a .40 caliber Glock, each one tearing through metal and flesh with devastating precision. The sound must have been deafening in the enclosed space of the BMW, a percussion that left ears ringing and hearts racing. Tupac was hit 4 times, once in the chest, once in the arm, once in the thigh, and once in the pelvis. The bullets found their mark with surgical precision, as if the shooter had trained for this moment. Suge Knight was grazed in the head by a bullet fragment, nothing life-threatening, but enough to leave him bloodied and shaken. By 1998, their relationship had deteriorated into something ugly and volatile. Ted's paranoia, fueled by years of involvement with dangerous people and dangerous money, had reached a fever pitch. He was convinced that Sandra was stealing from him, that she was planning to leave him, that she was conspiring with others to destroy him, and maybe, just maybe, he was right about all of it. Rick Tabish enters our story like a character from a noir film, handsome, charming, and absolutely ruthless. He was a construction contractor from Montana who had caught Ted's attention with promises of building a secret vault in the desert, a place where Ted could hide his most precious possessions from the prying eyes of government agents and criminal associates alike. The vault itself was a thing of beauty and paranoia, buried deep in the Nevada desert in Pump, about an hour's drive from Las Vegas. I've stood at that location, looking out over the endless expanse of sand and scrub brush, and I can understand why Ted chose it. It's the kind of place where secrets can stay buried forever, where the desert wind covers all tracks and the sun bleaches all evidence until nothing remains but bones and regret. Inside that vault, Ted stored millions of dollars in silver bars and coins, a treasure trove that represented not just wealth, but insurance against a world he no longer trusted. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood there in that empty desert. Ted Binion had spent his life accumulating money, only to bury it like a pirate, afraid of his own crew. But Rick Tabish saw opportunity in Ted's paranoia. As the contractor responsible for building and maintaining the vault, he knew exactly what was inside and exactly how to get to it. All he needed was for Ted Binion to be out of the picture permanently. September 17, 1998. Dawned hot and cloudless, the kind of day that makes the Nevada desert feel like the surface of another planet. I can imagine Ted Binion waking up in his Palomino Lane mansion, perhaps looking out at his perfectly manicured lawn and feeling the weight of all his enemies pressing down on him like the desert sun. Sandra Murphy was there that morning, as she had been so many mornings before, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't alone in her intentions. The official cause of death was listed as an overdose, combination of heroin and Xanax that proved fatal. But from the moment the first responders arrived at the scene, something felt wrong. Ted Binion was found lying on a yoga mat in his den, positioned too perfectly, too peacefully, for someone who had supposedly died in the throes of a drug overdose. I've walked through that den dozens of times, trying to reconstruct what happened in those final moments. The room is spacious but intimate, with large windows that look out onto the desert landscape Ted loved so much. There's a serenity to the space that makes the violence of what occurred there even more disturbing. The coroner who performed the autopsy, Dr. Larry Sims, found something that changed everything: bruising on Ted's chest consistent with someone pressing down on him while he was dying. It was a detail that transformed what looked like a suicide or accidental overdose into something far more sinister. But that wasn't the only evidence that pointed to murder. Ted Binion was a veteran drug user, someone who had been using heroin for years and had built up a substantial tolerance. The amount of drugs found in his system, while fatal, wasn't consistent with the behavior of an experienced addict. It was as if someone had calculated the exact amount needed to kill him and then forced it into his system. The investigation revealed that Sandra Murphy had been having an affair with Rick Tabish for months before Ted's death. Phone records showed dozens of calls between them in the weeks leading up to September 17th. Conversations that painted a picture of two lovers plotting the perfect murder. Less than 24 hours after Ted Binion's body was discovered, Rick Tabish was found in the Nevada desert with several associates, digging up Ted's buried vault. When confronted by authorities, he claimed he was there on Ted's instructions, but the timing was too convenient to be believed. I remember standing in that desert location, watching the sun set over the mountains and trying to imagine the scene that played out there. Rick and his crew, working by moonlight to uncover millions of dollars in buried treasure, while the man who owned it lay cooling in the coroner's office. There's something almost mythical about it. Modern-day grave robbers, operating in the shadow of the neon lights of Las Vegas. The arrest came quickly after that. Sandra Murphy and Rick Tabish were charged with first-degree murder, and the case that followed would captivate the nation and expose the dark underbelly of Las Vegas high society. The trial was a media circus, with cameras capturing every moment of the proceedings and reporters dissecting every piece of evidence. I sat in that courtroom day after day, watching as the prosecution built their case piece by piece, like assembling a jigsaw puzzle made of lies and betrayal. The prosecution's theory was simple, but devastating. Sandra Murphy and Rick Tabish had conspired to murder Ted Binion for his money. They had forced a fatal dose of heroin and Xanax down his throat, then waited for him to die before rushing to claim their prize from the desert vault. The defense fought back hard, painting Ted Binion as a paranoid drug addict who had finally succumbed to his demons. They argued that Sandra genuinely loved Ted despite his flaws, and that Rick's presence at the vault was pure coincidence. But the evidence told a different story. Forensic experts testified about the bruising on Ted's chest, about the way the drugs had been administered, about the impossibility of the official timeline. Witnesses came forward to describe Sandra's behavior in the days before Ted's death cold, calculating already spending money she hadn't inherited yet. If you've been following this story and feeling that chill run down your spine, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another night of true crime, because this is only the beginning of how dark this story gets. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: Ted Binion himself. In the months before his death, he had grown increasingly suspicious of Sandra and had begun taking steps to protect himself. He had changed his will, removing Sandra as a beneficiary. He had hired private investigators to follow her, and most importantly, he had confided in friends that he feared Sandra was trying to kill him. One witness testified that Ted had said, "If I'm found dead, it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't suicide. Sandy Murphy killed me." Those words, spoken from beyond the grave, would prove to be prophetic. The jury deliberated for days, and I remember the tension in that courthouse as everyone waited for their decision. Las Vegas held its breath, wondering if justice would prevail in a city built on the premise that the house always wins. On May 19, 2000, Sandra Murphy and Rick Tabish were found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdicts sent shockwaves through the Las Vegas community, proving that even in Sin City, there were still some lines you couldn't cross without consequences. But the story didn't end there. Appeals were filed, new evidence was presented, and in 2003, the Nevada Supreme Court overturned the convictions on technical grounds. A new trial was ordered, and once again, the case would play out in the harsh light of public scrutiny. The second trial was different from the first. The defense team was better prepared, the evidence was re-examined, and new theories were presented. This time, the prosecution struggled to make their case stick with the same certainty they had shown years earlier. In November 2004, Sandra Murphy was acquitted of murder, but convicted of conspiracy, grand larceny, and burglary. She was sentenced, 2 times served, and walked out of prison a free woman. Rick Tabish was convicted of burglary and grand larceny, related to the vault incident, but was also acquitted of murder. The verdicts left many people unsatisfied. Ted Binion's family believed that justice had not been served, that his killers had literally gotten away with murder. Others felt that the prosecutions had been overzealous, that 2 people had been wrongly convicted based on circumstantial evidence and media hysteria. I've walked through Ted Binion's house many times since then, and I always end up in that den where his body was found. The current owners have renovated extensively, but I can still sense the weight of what happened there. Death leaves a mark on a place that no amount of paint or new furniture can completely erase. The vault in the desert has long since been empty, its contents dispersed through legal proceedings and criminal restitution. But I've stood there at sunset, looking out over the endless expanse of sand and sky, and I can almost see the ghosts of that night when greed and murder collided under the Nevada stars. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, chaos reigned. The white Cadillac sped away into the Las Vegas night, swallowed by the darkness between streetlights. Suge, despite his head wound, managed to drive the BMW away from the intersection, but the car soon came to a stop about a mile away when he realized the severity of Tupac's injuries. I remember the 911 calls from that night, the panic in civilian voices as they reported shots fired, a car speeding erratically down Flamingo Road. One caller described seeing a lot of blood in the black BMW, and the fear in her voice was palpable even through the static of the police radio. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and Tupac was rushed to University Medical Center. I've walked those hospital corridors many times since then, and they still echo with the urgency of that night. The trauma team worked frantically to save him, but the damage was extensive. The bullet to his chest had punctured his right lung, and the one to his pelvis had caused severe internal bleeding. For 6 days, Tupac fought for his life in that hospital bed. I can only imagine the vigil that must have been kept by his friends and family, watching the monitors, listening to the rhythmic beep of life support machines, hoping for a miracle that would never come. On September 13, 1996, at 4:03 p.m., Tupac Shakur was pronounced dead. He was 25 years old. The investigation that followed was a masterpiece of frustration and dead ends. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department interviewed hundreds of witnesses, but the code of silence that governed the hip-hop community in those days was absolute. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. Nobody knew anything. Orlando Anderson was questioned multiple times, but was never charged in connection with the shooting. He maintained his innocence until his death in 1998, killed in an unrelated gang shooting in Compton. Some say his death was the final chapter in a cycle of violence that began that night in Vegas. Others believe the real killers are still out there, their secret buried as deep as Tupac himself. The white Cadillac was never found, despite numerous tips and alleged sightings. It simply vanished into the Nevada desert like a ghost car from a fever dream. Some investigators believe it was destroyed within hours of the shooting, reduced to scrap metal and scattered across multiple junkyards to ensure it could never tell its story. What haunts me most about this case isn't the violence itself, but the ripple effects. Tupac's death sent shockwaves through not just the music industry, but through American culture itself. He was more than a rapper, he was a voice for the voiceless, a poet who could articulate the struggles of inner city life with a clarity that cut through all the noise. The intersection where he was shot has become an unlikely pilgrimage site. I've seen fans from around the world standing at that corner, some crying, some angry, all trying to make sense of a senseless tragedy. The city has changed around that intersection, new buildings, new businesses, but the shadows remain the same. There's a theory that Tupac's murder was connected to the broader East Coast-West Coast hip-hop rivalry that was tearing the music industry apart in the mid-90s. Just 6 months later, the notorious B.I.G. would be gunned down in Los Angeles, under similarly mysterious circumstances, and many believe the two murders were connected acts of retaliation in a war that nobody really understood. But standing at that intersection on East Flamingo Road, watching the traffic lights cycle from green to yellow to red, I'm struck by how ordinary it all looks. This is where one of America's most important artists drew his last free breath, and yet life goes on around it as if nothing happened. Cars stop for the light, people go about their business, and the desert wind carries away the echoes of gunshots. That changed everything. The case officially remains unsolved, filed away in the depths of the Las Vegas Police Department's Cold Case Division. But for those of us who walk in the shadows of true crime, Tupac's murder represents something more than just an unsolved homicide. It's a symbol of how violence can reach out and snatch away genius, how the streets can claim even those who try to rise above them. As I stood there in the heat of that Vegas summer, looking at the spot where blood once stained the asphalt, I couldn't help but think about all the music that would never be made, all the words that would never be spoken, all the lives that might have been changed if Tupac had lived to see his 26th birthday. The neon lights of Las Vegas promise that what happens here stays here, but some secrets are too big to contain. Tupac's murder leaked out into the world, becoming part of the dark mythology of a city built on dreams and sustained by desperation. And somewhere out there, in the sprawling desert that surrounds Sin City, someone knows exactly what happened that night. Someone remembers the weight of the gun in their hands, the sound of bullets piercing metal and flesh, the way the BMW's taillights disappeared into the darkness as they sped away from the intersection. But they're not talking. They've taken their secret and buried it as deep as the bodies that lie beneath the Nevada sand. And maybe that's the way it will always be, because in Las Vegas, the house always wins, and sometimes the only prize is silence. The desert wind was howling the night I first walked through the doors of the Horseshoe Casino, carrying with it the whispers of a crime so brutal, so methodically planned, that it would become known as one of the most shocking murders in Las Vegas history. The year was 1998, and the neon-soaked streets of downtown Vegas were about to witness something that would make even the most hardened gamblers fold their cards and walk away. Ted Binion was royalty in this town, casino royalty, the kind that came with both immense power and deadly enemies. As I stood in his former office at Binion's Horseshoe, surrounded by the ghosts of high-stakes games and million-dollar deals, I could almost feel the weight of the secrets these walls had witnessed. The air still carried the faint scent of expensive cigars and the metallic tang of fear that comes when someone realizes their luck has finally run out. Benny Binion, Ted's father, had built an empire in this desert oasis, transforming a rough frontier town into the gambling capital of the world. The Horseshoe wasn't just a casino, it was a monument to American excess, where million-dollar games were played with the casual indifference of men who had already seen everything money could buy. And Ted Binion, as Benny's son, was born into this world of infinite wealth and infinite danger. But power in Las Vegas has always come with a price. And by 1998, Ted Binion was learning just how steep that price could be. I remember the first time I saw photographs of Ted's house on Palomino Lane, a sprawling ranch-style mansion that seemed to crouch in the desert like a predator waiting to strike. The house sat on 2.5 acres of manicured landscape, an oasis of green in the brown wasteland that surrounds Vegas. It was here, in this fortress of wealth and paranoia, that Ted Binion would draw his last breath on September 17, 1998. The morning I walked through that house, months after the murder, I could still sense the violence that had occurred there. The living room where Ted's body was found still felt heavy with the weight of death, and I found myself holding my breath as I stood in the exact spot where a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars had died like a common street junkie. Ted Binion's relationship with Sandra Murphy began in the kind of place where such relationships always begin in Vegas, in the shadow of money and desperation. She was a California girl, blonde and beautiful, working as a dancer and occasional escort when she met the casino heir in 1995. He was 50, she was 26, and the attraction was immediate and toxic. I've seen the surveillance footage from those early days, grainy black and white images of Ted and Sandra walking through the casino floor, her arm linked through his, both of them radiating the kind of dangerous confidence that comes from believing you're untouchable. He showered her with gifts, jewelry, cars, a lifestyle that most people can only dream of. But in Ted's world, everything came with strings attached, and those strings were about to become a noose. Sandra Murphy disappeared from public view after her release, trying to rebuild a life shattered by years of legal proceedings and media attention. Rick Tabish returned to Montana, where he continues to maintain his innocence to this day. But Ted Binion remains dead, and the questions surrounding his death remain unanswered. Was it murder, carefully planned and coldly executed? Or was it the tragic end of a troubled man whose paranoia and drug addiction finally caught up with him? The truth, like so many truths in Las Vegas, remains buried somewhere in the desert, hidden beneath layers of sand and time, and the kind of secrets that people kill to protect. What haunts me most about this case isn't the violence, or the greed, it's the loneliness. Ted Binion was surrounded by people who wanted his money, but not a single person who genuinely cared whether he lived or died. He died alone in his mansion, betrayed by the woman he loved and murdered for the wealth that was supposed to protect him. In Las Vegas, they say the house always wins, but Ted Binion's story proves that sometimes everybody loses. The only winners were the lawyers who got rich off the trials, and the desert that got to keep its secrets buried deep in the sand, where the wind can never blow them away. The summer heat in Las Vegas in 2001 was merciless, the kind that makes asphalt soft underfoot and turns car steering wheels into instruments of torture. I remember standing in the parking lot of a suburban Henderson home at 2332 Peaceful River Avenue, watching the crime scene tape flutter in the desert wind like prayer flags, marking a place where all prayers had gone unanswered. The house looked innocuous enough from the outside, middle-class suburban America, complete with a 2-car garage and a small front lawn that someone had tried valiantly to keep green despite the punishing Nevada sun. But inside that house, something had happened that would haunt me for years to come. Something so brutal, so senseless, that it challenged everything I thought I knew about human nature and the depths of evil that can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. The Darrant family had moved to Las Vegas seeking the American dream, drawn, like so many others, by the promise of jobs and sunshine and a fresh start in the desert. Charles Darrant was a construction worker, the kind of man who built this city with his bare hands, one concrete foundation at a time. His wife Linda worked as a clerk at a local department store, supplementing their income and dreaming of better days ahead. Their 3 children, Marcus, 16, Keisha, 13, and little Trevon, just 8 years old, were typical kids. navigating the complexities of adolescence and childhood in a town that never quite felt like home. I've walked through their neighborhood many times since that terrible summer, and it strikes me how normal everything looks. Tract housing stretching to the horizon, each home a variation on the same theme of middle American aspiration. Children's bikes abandoned in driveways, sprinkler systems fighting a losing battle against the desert heat, the occasional sound of a television or radio drifting through open windows. It's the kind of place where the worst thing that usually happens is a stolen newspaper or a barking dog complaint to the homeowners association. But on the night of July 15, 2001, pure evil walked through the front door of 2332 Peaceful River Avenue, and nothing would ever be the same. The Darrant family had been having trouble with a neighbor for months. Petty disputes about property lines, noise complaints, the kind of suburban friction that usually gets resolved with awkward conversations and grudging apologies. But Jeremy Strohmeyer wasn't your typical problem neighbor. He was 19 years old, already carrying the weight of a criminal record that included assault and drug possession. And he had developed an obsessive hatred for the Darrant family that went far beyond normal neighborly disputes. I've studied Jeremy's background extensively, trying to understand how a teenager becomes capable of such monstrous acts. Born and raised in Las Vegas, he was the product of a broken home and a series of foster placements that left him angry, isolated, and increasingly violent. His criminal record began in junior high with shoplifting and escalated through assault, vandalism, and drug-related crimes. By the time he was 19, he had already spent time in juvenile detention and was well known to local law enforcement, but nothing in his file suggested he was capable of what happened on that July night. The temperature that evening was still hovering around 95 degrees. At 11 p.m., the kind of oppressive heat that makes everyone irritable and short-tempered. The Darrant family was preparing for bed, following the same routine they had followed for months since moving to Henderson. Charles was in the garage, organizing tools for the next day's work. Linda was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner and setting out clothes for the children's summer activities. The kids were scattered throughout the house, Marcus playing video games in his room, Keisha reading in bed, little Trevon already asleep with a favorite stuffed animal clutched in his arms. They had no way of knowing that Jeremy Strohmeyer had been drinking and taking methamphetamines that day, feeding a rage that had been building for months. They had no way of knowing that he had armed himself with a baseball bat and a kitchen knife, weapons that would turn their suburban home into a slaughterhouse. The first indication that something was wrong came when the family's dog, a German shepherd named Rex, began barking frantically in the backyard. Charles went to investigate, stepping out through the sliding glass door that led from the kitchen to the small patio where they sometimes grilled hamburgers and watched the desert sunsets. Jeremy was waiting for him. The attack was swift and brutal. The baseball bat connected with Charles's skull with a sound like a wooden board breaking, and he dropped to the concrete patio without making a sound. But Jeremy wasn't finished. He continued beating the unconscious man with a fury that spoke to years of pent-up rage and chemical-induced psychosis. Linda heard the commotion and came running, but she had no chance against Jeremy's drug-fueled violence. The knife found her throat before she could scream, and she collapsed next to her husband, her blood mixing with his on the patio stones that would never quite come clean, no matter how many times they were scrubbed. Inside the house, the children heard sounds that their young minds couldn't quite process. Marcus, the oldest, was the first to investigate. He found Jeremy standing over his parents' bodies, covered in blood and breathing hard from the exertion of murder. "Please," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heart pounding. "Please, don't hurt us." But Jeremy was beyond reason, beyond mercy, beyond any recognizable human emotion except rage. The bat found Marcus next, and the 16-year-old who had been dreaming of his driver's license and graduation joined his parents in death. 13-year-old Keisha tried to hide in her bedroom closet, pulling clothes around her small body and praying to a god who seemed to have abandoned this house to evil. But Jeremy found her anyway, dragging her out by her hair and showing her the same merciless violence he had shown her family. Little Trevon never woke up. He died in his sleep, clutching his stuffed animal, never knowing that the world had turned into a nightmare around him. In some ways, that small mercy was the only kindness shown in that house of horrors. The crime scene was discovered the next morning when Charles failed to show up for work and his supervisor sent someone to check on him. The first responding officers were veterans, men who had seen everything Las Vegas had to offer in terms of human depravity. But even they were shaken by what they found at 2332 Peaceful River Avenue. I remember talking to Detective Maria Rodriguez, who worked the case, and she told me that in 20 years of police work, she had never seen a crime scene that haunted her the way this one did. It wasn't just the violence, she said, staring out at the Las Vegas skyline from her office window. It was the senselessness of it. 5 people dead because of what? A property line dispute, noise complaints. It was evil for the sake of evil. The investigation moved quickly. Jeremy Strohmeyer had made no attempt to cover his tracks, leaving fingerprints and DNA evidence throughout the house. When police found him the next day, he was still wearing clothes stained with the Darrant family's blood, and he confessed, almost immediately, seeming almost relieved that his terrible secret was finally revealed. But his confession was rambling and incoherent, a mix of self-justification and drug-addled rationalizations that made no logical sense. He claimed the family had been asking for it, that they had disrespected him, that he had been forced to defend himself. None of it held water, but it provided a glimpse into the twisted psychology of a man who could murder an entire family over suburban grudges. The trial was mercifully brief. With overwhelming physical evidence and a full confession, the outcome was never in doubt. Jeremy Strohmeyer was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, joining the long line of killers waiting on Nevada's death row. Money was always at the center of their conflicts. Ron had accumulated millions through decades of hard work and smart investments, and he guarded his wealth with the paranoia of a man who understood that, in Las Vegas, everyone is trying to separate you from your money, including the woman sharing your bed. Margaret, on the other hand, had grown accustomed to a lifestyle that required constant infusions of cash. Designer clothes, expensive jewelry, luxury cars. She had developed tastes that exceeded even a millionaire's ability to satisfy. And as their marriage deteriorated, she began to see Ron's wealth not as something to share, but as something to inherit. The transformation from loving wife to calculating predator didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, like cancer spreading through healthy tissue. And by 1994, the woman Ron had fallen in love with had become someone else entirely, someone capable of murder. December 18, 1994, was a Sunday, the kind of crisp winter day that makes living in the desert almost bearable. The temperature was in the 60s. Perfect weather for the kind of outdoor activities that draw people to Nevada in the first place. Ron Rudin had plans that day, business meetings, and social obligations that would keep him busy until evening. He was last seen alive leaving his home around 10 a.m., driving his Mercedes-Benz toward downtown Las Vegas. Security cameras at various businesses captured his image throughout the day, always alone, always appearing normal and relaxed. A successful man going about his successful life, with no indication that he had only hours left to live. Margaret's story about that day would change multiple times over the years that followed, but her initial version was simple and seemingly innocent. She claimed that Ron had left their home that morning in an agitated state, talking about meeting someone about a business deal. She said she spent the day shopping and running errands, returning home to find Ron gone, and assuming he would be back later. But Ron Rudin never came back. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. The initial missing person investigation was perfunctory at best. Ron was a wealthy businessman with complex financial dealings and potential enemies. It wasn't unusual for such men to disappear temporarily, either by choice or by force. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department filed the report and waited for developments, expecting either a ransom demand or Ron's eventual return with a reasonable explanation. Neither ever came, as days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months. The investigation intensified. Detectives began looking more closely at Ron's personal life, his business relationships, and especially his marriage to the beautiful and increasingly suspicious Margaret. What they found was a web of financial manipulation that stretched back years. Margaret had been systematically draining Ron's accounts, forging his signature on checks, and selling off assets without his knowledge. She had also taken out several large insurance policies on his life, naming herself as the beneficiary. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: Ron himself. In the months before his disappearance, Ron had grown increasingly paranoid about Margaret's behavior and had begun taking steps to protect himself. He had hired a private investigator to follow her, changed his will to reduce her inheritance, and most importantly, he had begun wearing a small recording device during their conversations. Those recordings, discovered after his disappearance, painted a chilling picture of a marriage in its death throes. Margaret could be heard making veiled threats, talking about ways to access Ron's money, and in one particularly damning conversation, discussing how much easier her life would be if Ron were simply out of the picture permanently. The recordings were circumstantial evidence, but they established motive and opportunity. The question remained: where was Ron Rudin's body? That question would torment investigators for years. They searched the Nevada desert, drained ponds and lakes, followed up on hundreds of tips from psychics and amateur detectives. Margaret had lawyered up immediately after Ron's disappearance and refused to cooperate with the investigation, maintaining her innocence while living lavishly off the wealth that had once belonged to her missing husband. If this case has you on the edge of your seat, wondering how deep this rabbit hole of deception goes, make sure you subscribe to Criminal Nights, because Margaret Rudin's story is about to take a turn that nobody saw coming. In 1997, nearly 3 years after Ron's disappearance, a group of hikers in the desert outside Las Vegas made a grisly discovery. Scattered across a remote wash, bleached white by the desert sun and picked clean by scavengers, were human bones. Lots of them. The Clark County Coroner's Office determined that the bones belonged to Ron Rudin, and the cause of death was listed as homicide. He had been shot multiple times with a .22 caliber pistol, and his body had been dumped in the desert to decompose naturally. But there was something else, something that would link Margaret Rudin directly to the crime, mixed in with Ron's bones. Investigators found pieces of a distinctive antique trunk that had been in their home, a piece of furniture that Margaret had claimed was stolen shortly after Ron's disappearance. The trunk had been used to transport Ron's body to the desert, and fragments of its distinctive hardware were scattered around the remains like a signature at the bottom of a confession. Margaret Rudin was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in 1999, but the case was far from over. She fled to Mexico, where she lived under assumed names for several years before being captured and extradited back to Nevada. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with Margaret cast as a glamorous black widow who had murdered her husband for money. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer who had lured Ron to his death, shot him execution style, and then dismembered his body to hide the evidence. The defense argued that Margaret was being framed, that Ron had been killed by business associates or criminal partners, and that she was simply a convenient scapegoat for a more complex conspiracy. But the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the financial fraud, the insurance policies, the antique trunk piece by piece. The prosecution built a case that left little room for reasonable doubt. On January 28, 2001, Margaret Rudin was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was 55 years old, and the luxurious lifestyle she had killed to maintain was officially over. I visited Margaret in prison several years after her conviction, hoping to understand what had driven her to murder. She was still beautiful, despite the years and the circumstances, but there was something hollow behind her eyes, like looking into rooms where all the furniture has been removed. She maintained her innocence, of course, weaving elaborate theories about who really killed Ron and why she was being persecuted by a system that couldn't accept a strong, independent woman. But her protestations rang hollow, like coins dropping into an empty well. Ron was a difficult man, she told me, staring at her hands as she spoke. He was controlling, jealous, paranoid. He made enemies everywhere he went. But I didn't kill him. I couldn't have killed him. When I asked her about the recordings, about the financial fraud, about the antique trunk, she had explanations for everything, explanations that became more elaborate and less believable with each telling. But the trial couldn't answer the question that haunted everyone who followed the case. How does a 19-year-old become capable of such monstrous evil? What combination of circumstances, mental illness, and moral corruption creates someone who can murder children in their beds? I've visited Jeremy on death row several times over the years, trying to understand what happened that night. He's older now, his hair thinning, his face bearing the weight of more than 2 decades behind bars. Sometimes he claims to remember nothing about the murders, saying the drugs have erased his memory. Other times he breaks down and cries, begging forgiveness for crimes he can never undo. I wasn't myself that night, he told me during one visit, his voice barely above a whisper. It was like watching someone else do those things, someone wearing my body, but not my soul. But the question remains, if he wasn't himself that night, then who was? And what happened to the Jeremy Stromier who existed before he became a family annihilator? The house at 2332 Peaceful River Avenue sits empty now. A monument to tragedy that real estate agents struggled to sell despite repeatedly dropping the price. Local residents whisper about it being haunted, about strange sounds heard in the night, about the ghost of little Trevon still playing in a yard that will never again hear children's laughter. I've stood in that empty house many times, walking through rooms where an entire family died for no reason anyone can understand. The silence is oppressive, broken only by the settling of wood and the distant hum of air conditioners in neighboring homes. The bloodstains are gone, covered by new carpet and fresh paint, but the weight of what happened here remains. The Henderson Police Department keeps the case file in their archive. 5 thick folders containing crime scene photos, witness statements, and forensic evidence that tells the story of one terrible night when evil visited a suburban street and left nothing but death in its wake. Detective Rodriguez retired years ago, but she still carries the weight of this case. Still wonders if there was something she could have done to prevent it. We see patterns in most murders, she told me during our last conversation. Domestic violence, drug deals gone wrong, gang activity. There's usually some logic to it, even if it's twisted logic. But this case, it was like looking into an abyss and realizing that sometimes people kill just because they can. The victims were buried together in a Las Vegas cemetery, 5 graves side by side under the desert sun. I've visited their resting place many times, and it strikes me how peaceful it is compared to the violence of their final moments. Charles and Linda Darrant, together in death as they were in life. Marcus, Keisha, and Trevon, their young lives cut short by a senseless act of violence that no amount of justice can ever truly balance. Their gravestone bears a simple inscription, "Together forever, safe in God's arms." But for those of us who investigate these dark corners of human nature, the question remains, whether God was present at all on that terrible night in Henderson, or whether he had temporarily abandoned 2332 Peaceful River Avenue to forces that no prayer could hold back. Jeremy Strohmeyer remains on death row, his appeals exhausted, his execution date approaching with the inevitable certainty of desert sunrise. When that day comes, the state of Nevada will inject lethal drugs into his veins, and he will join his victims in whatever comes after this world of pain and violence. But his death won't bring back the Darrant family. It won't erase the memory of what happened in that suburban house, and it won't answer the questions that keep me awake at night. Walking the dark streets of Las Vegas, and wondering how many other Jeremy Strohmeyers are out there, nursing their grievances and feeding their rage, waiting for the right combination of drugs, an opportunity, and moral collapse to turn them into monsters. Because that's the real horror of the Darrant family murders, not that they happened, but that they could happen again, tonight, tomorrow, in any suburban neighborhood where ordinary people live ordinary lives, never suspecting that evil might be living right next door, separated from their own homes by nothing more than a property line and a prayer that might not be enough when the darkness finally comes calling. The Palomino Club sits on the north side of Las Vegas, like a neon-soaked relic from another era, its pink and purple lights cutting through the desert darkness with the desperate intensity of a dying star. I've stood in that parking lot at 3 a.m. more times than I care to count, listening to the distant thrum of music and the occasional laugh that carries just a little too much desperation to be genuine. This is where dreams come to die slowly, $1 bill at a time, and where some people discover that the only thing worse than having nothing to lose is having everything to lose and losing it. Anyway, it was in this world of artificial desire and manufactured fantasy that I first learned about Margaret Rudin, though. At the time, nobody knew her by that name. She was just another woman working the margins of Las Vegas society, trading on her looks and her wits to survive in a city that devours the weak and spits out their bones in the desert. But Margaret Rudin would become something more than just another casualty of Sin City's endless appetite for destruction. She would become one of the most notorious Black Widows in American criminal history. The story begins, as so many Las Vegas stories do, with money. Lots of money. Ron Rudin was a millionaire real estate developer, the kind of man who built this city from sand and ambition, one shopping center and office complex at a time. By 1994, he was 64 years old, wealthy beyond most people's dreams, and married to his fifth wife, a woman 23 years younger, who had entered his life like a beautiful poison. Sweet at first taste, but deadly in larger doses. I remember the first time I saw photographs of Margaret and Ron together, taken at various charity events and social gatherings around Las Vegas. They looked like the perfect power couple, him distinguished and so radiating the confidence that comes from decades of successful deal-making, and her stunning in that particular Las Vegas way, blonde and polished and dangerous as a loaded gun in silk gloves. But appearances, as I've learned over years of investigating crimes in this city, can be more deceiving than a rigged slot machine. Margaret Rudin, born Margaret Frost, had arrived in Las Vegas in the early 1990s with a history that should have served as a warning to any man smart enough to read the signs. She had been married multiple times before, and her previous husbands had a disturbing tendency to die under suspicious circumstances. But Ron Rudin was a successful businessman, a man who had built an empire by taking calculated risks, and he believed he could handle whatever secrets his beautiful young wife might be hiding. He was wrong about that. Dead wrong. Their marriage was turbulent from the beginning, marked by explosive fights and passionate reconciliations that played out in the spotlight of Las Vegas high society. I've talked to friends and business associates who witnessed their relationship, and they all describe the same pattern: periods of apparent happiness, followed by screaming matches that could be heard through the walls of expensive restaurants and exclusive country clubs. The truth, I realized, was something Margaret Rudin would never acknowledge, even to herself. She had committed the perfect crime in her own mind, and the fact that she had been caught and convicted was simply proof that the world was unfair, not that she was guilty. Ron Rudin's real estate empire was eventually liquidated, the proceeds distributed among his children from previous marriages and various creditors. The house where he and Margaret had lived was sold and resold, but local real estate agents whisper that it's hard to keep tenants, as if the violence that began there has left a permanent stain on the property. Margaret Rudin remains in prison. Today, an aging woman who traded everything for money and ended up with neither wealth nor freedom. She has become a cautionary tale told in the bars and restaurants of Las Vegas, a reminder that in a city built on taking chances, some bets have consequences that last forever. The desert wash where Ron's body was found has been developed now, turned into another subdivision of tract homes where families live their ordinary lives, unaware that they're building their dreams on ground that once held the scattered bones of a murdered millionaire. But on certain nights, when the wind blows just right across the Nevada desert, you can almost hear the echoes of that .22 caliber pistol firing its deadly rounds, and the whispered promises of a beautiful woman who learned too late that some prices are simply too high to pay, no matter how much money is at stake. Because in Las Vegas, the house always wins, but sometimes the players destroy themselves in the process, leaving nothing behind but bones in the desert and stories that serve as warnings to the next generation of dreamers and schemers who think they can beat the odds that have already beaten so many others. Margaret Rudin thought she could have it all: the money, the lifestyle, the freedom to start over with a clean slate. Instead, she got a prison cell and a legacy as one of the most notorious black widows in American criminal history. A woman who discovered that murdering for money is the one bet in Las Vegas that never pays off in the end. The Prim Valley Resort sits at the edge of nowhere, 30 miles south of Las Vegas on the California border, a collection of buildings that rise from the desert like a mirage that refused to disappear. When you got close enough to see it clearly, I've driven that stretch of Interstate 15 countless times, watching the casino's neon sign grow larger in my windshield as I approached the scene of what would become one of the most puzzling disappearances in Nevada history. It was here, in this isolated outpost between two states, that Mame Johnson vanished without a trace on the night of March 15th, 2003, leaving behind only questions that have never been answered and a mystery that continues to haunt everyone who knew her story. Mame Johnson was 34 years old, a divorced mother of two from Phoenix who had come to Las Vegas, seeking the same thing that draws millions of people to this desert oasis every year: a chance to change her luck. She worked as a dental hygienist, a profession that required steady hands and infinite patience, qualities that served her well in the high-stakes environment of Sin City's dental offices, where wealthy clients paid premium prices for perfect smiles. I remember the first time I saw a photograph of Mame, taken just weeks before her disappearance at a friend's birthday party. She was laughing at something off camera, her auburn hair catching the light, her green eyes sparkling with the kind of joy that seems almost impossible to fake. She looked like someone who had found her place in the world, someone who had made peace with her past and was excited about her future. But appearances, as I've learned in my years of investigating the dark corners of human nature, can be the most dangerous lies of all. Mame had been living in Las Vegas for 3 years by the time she disappeared, renting a small apartment in Henderson and working at a prestigious dental practice on the Strip. Her colleagues described her as reliable, professional, and well-liked by both staff and patients. She sent money home to Phoenix regularly to help support her children, who lived with their father, and she spoke often of her plans to bring them to Nevada once she had saved enough for a larger place. On the surface, her life appeared to be exactly what she had hoped for when she first made the drive across the desert with everything she owned, packed into a 10-year-old Honda Civic. But like so many people drawn to Las Vegas, Mame had secrets that would ultimately lead her to a roadside casino in the middle of nowhere, and a fate that no one could have predicted. The gambling addiction had started small, as these things always do. A few dollars in the slot machines after work, the occasional weekend trip to the locals' casinos, where drinks were cheap and the atmosphere was more relaxed than the tourist traps on the strip. For someone making good money in a stable profession, it seemed harmless enough, just another form of entertainment in a city built on entertainment. But gambling addiction is like quicksand. The more you struggle against it, the faster it pulls you down. By 2003, Mame was losing thousands of dollars every month, chasing wins that never came, borrowing money from friends and colleagues to fund her next session at the tables. Her neat, organized life was slowly collapsing under the weight of her compulsion, and she was running out of ways to hide the damage. March 15th, 2003, was a Saturday, one of those perfect desert days when the temperature hits 75 degrees and the sky is so blue, it almost hurts to look at directly. Mame had called in sick to work that Friday, claiming a stomach bug, but her colleagues later learned she had spent the day at the Red Rock Casino, feeding quarters into slot machines and watching her latest paycheck disappear one spin at a time. By Saturday evening, she was desperate. Her rent was due, her credit cards were maxed out, and she had borrowed against her next 3 paychecks. She needed a big win, and she needed it that night. The Prim Valley Resort, despite its isolation, was known among serious gamblers as a place where you could find higher limits and better odds than many of the strip casinos. The drive from Henderson took about 45 minutes, plenty of time to build up hope and convince yourself that tonight would be different, that the cards, or the dice, or the spinning reels would finally break in your favor. Security footage from the casino shows Mame arriving at approximately 8:30 p.m., parking her Honda Civic in the nearly empty lot and walking through the front doors with the determined stride of someone on a mission. She was dressed casually: jeans, a light sweater, sneakers, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed her luck was about to change. The casino floor at Prim Valley wasn't huge, but it was well designed with clear sight lines from the security office and cameras positioned to capture every angle of every table and machine. I've studied those tapes dozens of times, watching Mame move through the space like a woman possessed, starting at the blackjack tables and gradually working her way toward the higher stakes poker games in the back of the room. She was a good player, that much was clear from watching her technique. She understood the odds, knew when to hit and when to stand, could read other players' tells with the skill of a professional. For the first few hours, she was actually winning, building her initial stake of $500 into nearly $3,000 by midnight. But then the cards turned cold. I've talked to dealers who worked that night, and they all remember Mame's transformation as her winning streak evaporated. The confident, cheerful woman who had been joking with other players became tense and withdrawn, her bets growing larger as her chip stack grew smaller. She was chasing her losses now, caught in the classic gambler's trap of believing that one big win could solve all her problems. By 2 a.m., she was down to her last $100. The surveillance footage shows her sitting alone at a blackjack table, staring at her remaining chips as if she could will them to multiply through sheer force of concentration. The few other players had long since gone home or moved to different games, leaving her isolated in the artificial twilight of the casino floor. That's when Vincent Reno entered the picture. Vincent was a high roller from Los Angeles, the kind of player casinos roll out the red carpet, 4 comped rooms, free drinks, personal hosts to attend to his every need. He was in his 50s, expensively dressed, and carrying himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never worried about money in his life. The security footage shows him approaching Mame's table around 2:15 a.m., taking the seat beside her and ordering 2 drinks from the cocktail waitress. They appeared to strike up a conversation immediately, and within minutes, Mame was laughing again. her earlier tension melting away under the influence of Vincent's charm and the prospect of someone else. Bankrolling her gambling, I've studied that footage frame by frame, trying to read their lips, analyzing their body language for clues about what was happening between them. Vincent appears to be offering her money not as a loan, but as a stake in some kind of partnership. Mame seems hesitant at first, but as the conversation continues, she becomes more animated, more interested in whatever he's proposing. At 2:47 a.m., they left the blackjack table together. Vincent cashed in his chips, nearly $15,000 in winnings from earlier in the evening, while Mame waited by his side, her face flushed with excitement and anticipation. The last clear footage of Mame Johnson shows her walking toward the casino's rear exit with Vincent Torino. At 2:52 a.m., she appears relaxed, even happy, as if whatever he had proposed had solved all her immediate problems. They disappear through the door that leads to the parking lot, and Mame Johnson vanishes from the world forever. Her Honda Civic was found the next morning, still parked in the casino lot with her purse and cell phone inside. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of violence, nothing to suggest that she had left the vehicle under duress. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the desert air, leaving behind only questions and the growing certainty that something terrible had happened in those dark hours before dawn. The investigation that followed consumed hundreds of man-hours and tens of thousands of dollars in resources, but it yielded frustratingly little solid evidence. Vincent Tojo existed. His identification was real. His credit cards were valid, and he had indeed been staying at the casino that night. But by the time police began looking for him, he had checked out and disappeared as completely as Mame herself. The Los Angeles address on his identification led to a vacant lot. The credit cards were registered to a shell company that existed only on paper. Even his fingerprints, lifted from the blackjack table where he had been playing, lead nowhere. No criminal record, no matches in any database. It was as if Vincent Torino was a ghost who had materialized just long enough to lure Mame Johnson into the darkness, then vanished back into whatever shadows had spawned him. The desert around Prim Valley was searched extensively, with teams of volunteers and professional searchers combing through washes, caves, and abandoned buildings for any trace of Mame's remains. Cadaver dogs were brought in, helicopters swept the area from above, and every tip from psychics and amateur detectives was investigated thoroughly. Nothing was ever found. As weeks turned to months, and months turned to years, theories about Mame's fate proliferated like desert weeds after a rare rainstorm. Some believed she had been murdered by Vincent Torino, either for reasons connected to gambling debts, or simply because she had witnessed something she shouldn't have. Others suggested she had voluntarily disappeared, using Vincent's help to stage her own death and start over somewhere else, free from her crushing financial problems. The most disturbing theory, whispered in the dark corners of Las Vegas's gambling community, was that Mame had become involved in something far more sinister than a simple card game, that Vincent Torino was connected to organized crime figures who used isolated casinos like Prim Valley as meeting places for activities that had nothing to do with legal gambling. I've spent years investigating this theory, following leads that dead-ended in corporate boardrooms and offshore bank accounts, talking to people who claimed to know something but always stopped short of providing concrete information. The trail of breadcrumbs leads into a maze of legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises so interconnected that it becomes impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. What I know for certain is that Mame Johnson was not the first person to disappear from Prim Valley Resort, and she would not be the last. The casino's isolated location, combined with its clientele of high-stakes gamblers and questionable characters, creates an environment where people can vanish without anyone asking to. Many questions until it's far too late. The desert keeps its secrets well, and the Nevada landscape is littered with the bones of people who thought they could beat odds that were never in their favor to begin with. Mame's children, now adults, still visit Las Vegas occasionally, hoping for new information about their mother's fate. I've met with them several times, sharing what little I've learned and watching their faces as hope and despair battle for control of their emotions. They deserve answers, deserve closure, deserve to know what happened to the woman who loved them enough to work in a city she feared in order to provide for their future. But the desert is vast, and the people who profit from its secrets are powerful, and some mysteries may be destined to remain unsolved until the desert itself gives up the dead. If you've made it this far into the darkness with us tonight, leave a comment with the word shadows so we know you're one of the brave ones who isn't afraid to stare into the abyss and acknowledge that sometimes the abyss stares back. 20 years have passed since Mame Johnson walked through those casino doors and into oblivion, but her case remains active in the files of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Detectives still follow up on tips, still hope that someone with knowledge of what happened that night will finally come forward and provide the answers that have eluded them for 2 decades. The Prim Valley Resort still operates, still draws gamblers from across the Southwest with promises of big wins and easy money. But those who know Mame's story approach the place with a sense of unease, wondering how many other secrets are buried in the desert sand that surrounds this isolated outpost of neon and false hope. As I stand in that parking lot where Mame left her car for the last time, watching the sun set over the mountains that separate Nevada from California, I can't help but think about all the people who have been swallowed by this desert over the years. The gambling addicts, the criminals on the run, the dreamers who came seeking fortune and found only dust and disappointment. Las Vegas sells itself as a city of second chances, a place where anyone can reinvent themselves and start over with a clean slate. But for every success story, there are dozens of tragedies. People like Mame Johnson, who came seeking redemption and found only destruction. The neon lights of the casino flicker on as darkness falls, advertising the same promises that have been made in this desert for decades: easy money, instant gratification, the chance to change your life with a single roll of the dice or turn of a card. But I know better now. I've seen what happens to those who believe too deeply in those promises, who stake their lives and their futures on games where the house always wins. Some of them end up broke and broken, returning home with empty pockets and hard-learned lessons about the nature of luck and probability. Others, like Ted Binion and Ron Rudin, become victims of violence perpetrated by those who see murder as just another way to beat the odds. And some, like Tupac, Shakur, and Mame Johnson, simply disappear into the void, leaving behind only questions and the growing certainty that Las Vegas keeps its darkest secrets buried beneath the desert floor, where the sun can bleach away all evidence and the wind can scatter the last traces of hope like dust across the endless expanse of sand and stone. Tonight, as you lay your head on your pillow and close your eyes, remember that somewhere in the Nevada desert, the truth about Mame Johnson lies waiting to be discovered. Her story, and the stories of all the others who have vanished in this city of lights and shadows, serves as a reminder that in the game of life, the house doesn't always win. Sometimes everyone loses. The desert remembers everything, even when we try to forget. The wind carries the whispers of the dead, and the stars look down on secrets that may never see the light of day. But we remember too. We tell these stories, we honor these victims, and we never stop searching for the truth, no matter how deeply it's buried or how powerful the forces that want to keep it hidden, because that's what we do in the shadows of true crime. We bear witness to the darkness. We speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves, and we hold on to hope that justice, like the desert sunrise, will eventually illuminate even the darkest corners of human nature. Good night, and sweet dreams.